Hello everyone, my name is Stephen O'Hara and I'm the publisher of Morton's Books and Bookazines, joined by Dan Sharp, who is the author of the highly successful Luftwaffe Secret series. We're going to spend a few minutes talking to Dan, and where we're going to delve into his understanding of the secret world of Luftwaffe and look ahead to the launch of his new book, Luftwaffe Secret Projects of the Third Reich. So Dan, what are German secret projects?
German secret projects, the ones that I look at, are really aircraft designs that either didn't make it to production, never actually built, or aircraft which only really reached the prototype stage. I really only look at projects that were drawn up during the sort of period of 1933 through to about 1945, so really literally the Third Reich period. Okay. So very little after that, although a couple of things after that. And very little before that. In terms of what is a project, or what are these aircraft, usually a project is would have been drawn up to meet a particular requirement or solve a particular problem. So in some instances that might be an aircraft that's designed as a fighter, or perhaps as a bomber, or for reconnaissance, or for some other purpose, transport or what have you. In other instances, project aircraft are designed for something slightly more unusual, perhaps to carry a particular weapon. Okay. Sometimes the weapons themselves are the projects. So that's what I'm looking at effectively. Things that weren't built, so in some ways you could regard them as aviation's losers. Aviation's, nearly men. They didn't quite make it. They didn't quite get all the way into being a real live action weapon used on the front line. Most never left the drawing board. So that's really what I'm focusing on in these bookazines.
What made you want to write about them?
Well, I suppose I started off being interested in those aircraft as a kid growing up in the 80s. I used to build models of Spitfires and Messerschmitt 109s, Focke-Wulf 190, Hurricanes, that kind of thing. Do the swooshing of them. You could build a model, flying it around, all that kind of business. And I had various books that people had bought for me as a kid, books about all the main fighter types, or bombers, things like the Lancaster, things like the Spitfire, things like the American Mustang and Thunderbolt, all those kinds of aircraft. I loved all that stuff when I was a kid. But as I got older, I kind of lost interest in it, and it kind of moved away a bit for me as I kind of got more interested in other things. But then, towards the end of the 1990s, I discovered a website was pointed out to me by a friend called Luft46.com. It's still there, I believe. And on this website, there were loads of really strange-looking aircraft. They were all German aircraft designs, but none of them were anything like anything I'd ever seen before. Some of them had, two fuselages. Some of them were kind of flying wings. They were kind of all different shapes and sizes with really strange, interesting configurations. And I kind of thought, what is all this stuff? What are these aircraft all about? And so for a short time, and with my friend, we kind of were interested in that kind of thing. But there was really no books, really very little literature around at that time that could tell you anything more about those aircraft. And a lot of the information that was presented about them was really quite vague, contradictory. Nearly every one of these projects failed because someone lost interest in it. And I thought, well, that can't be the case with everything. How can they just have lost interest in all these things? This project was put forward, and then someone's lost interest in it. It just didn't seem quite right to me. But again, over the years, kind of moved away from that, lost interest in it. But just recently, I'd started to get interested in doing archival research, probably 5-6 years ago. And I thought, well, now that I know how to access archives, I know what the process is, I know what the procedure is, I know some of the places to look, why don't I see if I can find out a bit more about those funny aircraft designs that I learnt about back in the late 90s? Maybe with the stuff that was captured perhaps from at the end of the Second World War, maybe I can find out some more about these strange and unusual designs. So I started digging around in various archives, and lo and behold, there was some of that material there. And some of the material I discovered clarified the background details of some of these projects that I'd read about before, and suddenly it became apparent that the people who'd written about them in the first instance, hadn't quite joined all the dots together. They hadn't quite seen the bigger picture in some instances. And so I was somehow able to start piecing these different bits and pieces together. And then I decided, well, why don't I write about it? Why don't I publish these findings so that other people can see what I think I've discovered, and then make their own minds up about it. And so that's really kind of how I got started.
Brilliant, thank you for that. So which secret projects can we expect to see in Luftwaffe secret projects of the Third Reich? And why did you choose these projects in particular?
Well, maybe I'll start with the cover star, which is the Blomenvoss P-171, 171, which is a Stuka, which is a dive bomber aircraft. Why did I choose it? I think I chose it because it's completely unknown at the moment. No one has ever previously seen any original material or any material at all relating to this particular project. Blomenvoss was an unusual aircraft manufacturer during the Second World War because they never really made any particular aircraft in any great quantities. They built some very large seaplanes like the BV-222, the BV-138, but they had ambitions to do so much more. They wanted to build dive bombers, they wanted to build fighters, they wanted to build jets towards the end, jet fighters and jet bombers, but they never really got the chance, so they're kind of a real secret projects company. They produced, I think, 215 project designs, right, some of which did go into production, so like the BV-222 started out as a project. But even for those production aircraft, they would have done several different drawings, different designs with different engines, different configurations of wings and tails and all this kind of business. And many of those designs, those 215 designs, have just never been seen before. There are certain ones which are quite well known, not famous necessarily, but people have heard of them. Other ones have there's just numbers on a sheet of paper. You know that there's a number 171, but you don't know what it is. You don't really know what it looks like. You don't really know hardly anything about it. And it just so happens that while I've been digging around, I've started to come across a number of these missing project numbers, these different missing projects from Blomenvoss. And perhaps the most interesting one that I found, or the most unusual one, recently was this P-171, which kind of has two engine nacelles effectively, but one of the engine nacelles is extended backwards to become a kind of cockpit and tail arrangement. The idea presumably being that the smaller frontal area you can have on your aircraft, the less drag you're going to have and the faster your aircraft's going to be. It doesn't seem like a very practical arrangement in terms of carrying bombs or guns, because the two propellers are quite close together, so it doesn't leave much space for weapons on either side. And also the centre of gravity is quite odd because it's heavier on one side than it is on the other. But it's just a really interesting aircraft. And so I thought, I'll go for that one. I'll put that on the front cover. Also, it looks really, it looks weird. What else have I put in there? There's the DFS Lotos, which is an anti-submarine glider. And you might think, well, how can a glider be used against submarines? What a strange concept. But the idea was, the Germans initially tried to do was to get a sonobuoy, so kind of a buoy that sits on the surface of the ocean or just beneath it, and then sends out pulses looking for submarines. What they wanted to do was drop one of these things from an aircraft, so it falls into the water, and then fly around in circles with a cable attached between the aircraft and the buoy, looking for submarines. They could then retract the buoy back up into the aircraft, fly it somewhere else, drop it down again, fly around in circles, and keep hunting for submarines that way. But what they discovered was that the cable was too heavy and it didn't play out very well. And sometimes it ended up dragging in the water. And as soon as the cable ended up dragging in the water, it could almost pull the aircraft down. It became really difficult to fly the aircraft when the cable got wet and under other certain conditions. So they tried this, I think, 5 times over several years and just couldn't get it to work. So in the end, they came up with an idea of, why don't we get a glider that can be towed out by an aircraft? We can then unhitch the glider. It can glide down to the surface of the water, sit there with the detecting equipment under the glider. It can even move itself around with a boat engine in the back of the glider on the surface of the water. And then as soon as you've finished looking for submarines, a seaplane can then fly down, land next to it, hook it up, and then both the seaplane and the glider fly off to the next location.
Right.
It's an interesting solution.
Yeah.
It never got built, but it's an interesting idea.
How long does it take you to write a Luftwaffe secret series? And how much research do you do?
It probably takes about 6 months.
Yeah.
But it's difficult really to pin down exactly how long it takes, because it's kind of an ongoing research project, if you like. So some of the things that I'm finding right now might not go into this particular publication. They might not go into the next one. They might not even go into the next one. I just kind of find these things and then keep them until a suitable vehicle or a suitable setting arises for me to publish what I found. I probably do a little bit of work on German secret projects every day, every evening. I'm constantly looking through documents. When I go to an archive or when I find some material, I typically don't look at it there and then. I'll usually scan it or photocopy it or photograph it and then take it away for later study. So then once I've gathered up sufficient material, I'll then take that away and then look at it and then compare it in context with other bits of material that I've got, and then try and piece it all together and try and make some sense of what I've discovered. And that's kind of the beginnings of the process of writing one of these volumes.
You've been writing about German projects, secret projects, for a long time now. Do you think there was anything more to say about them?
I think when I first started, I thought all I would be doing was finding stuff that people had already found and just trying to make more sense of it. As I said right at the start, my goal really was just to try and understand what the truth was behind these projects I'd already seen. But then when I started researching them, I realised there was actually things, I was discovering things which no one had seen before, which I'd never seen before. It's quite exciting when you open a folder or you look through onto a piece of microfilm reel and you see something that you don't think anyone's ever seen before. I've got probably every book, most books ever written about German secret projects. I've got a fairly substantial collection of these books. So I kind of know what's already been discovered for the most part. I think when I first started researching German secret projects, my very first bookazine on the subject was called Luftwaffe Secret Jets of the Third Reich. And when I wrote that, I'd done a lot of research, but I hadn't by any means seen everything that there was available to see. And subsequent to that, the more I've found, the more I've realised that the things I wrote in the very first instance, there's probably more of a story to tell about them. It's not quite as simple maybe as I imagined it was to begin with. Some things are actually more simple and less complicated than perhaps some people have made them seem. For example, things like the origins of the Focke-Wulf TA-152, Focke-Wulf 190 D9 and the Focke-Wulf TA-153. Some people have concocted some incredibly elaborate and extensive histories of how these three different designs interacted with each other or were kind of lumped together or where they all came from. And I've done some research now in that area, and it's actually a much simpler picture, I think, than most people have imagined. So I think as a sort of a broader narrative, I think there probably is more work to do in explaining these projects and uncovering exactly what really did go on
the evolution
in those days.
Okay. Is there one German secret project that you would really like to write about that you haven't?
The one that got away is probably the Henschel P-122, which was a twin-jet, high-altitude bomber, probably, aircraft. It's been very difficult to find any information about that design anywhere. Henschel was based in Berlin during the Second World War. Its headquarters were in Berlin. So when the Soviets surrounded Berlin and then eventually took the city, they either captured everything from Henschel, including all the project documents and details, or Henschel burned everything before the Soviets could get there. It's not entirely certain which.
So A little bit harder to get to.
Yeah, so their project documents, you can occasionally find little bits and pieces because other companies kept bits and pieces of Henschel's project documents. So when Henschel came up with a project, they wouldn't necessarily keep it all to themselves. They would involve an engine company, for example, like BMW. So they might interact with BMW and say, what kind of engines have you got that we could use for our project? So here's some documents about our project. What do you think? So when the war ended, BMW, who was, captured, all their material was captured by the Western Allies. BMW will have some small details on that Henschel project, and the same with the German Air Ministry, the RLM. They also have bits and pieces, or had bits and pieces on Henschel's projects, but there's nothing from Henschel, or very little from Henschel itself. So that really is something I would like to know more about, but I just can't at the moment. Sometimes projects are referenced obliquely.
Yeah.
There's some kind of slight inference about them, a discussion which might bear on them ever so slightly. But for that particular project, there's just nothing anywhere. I know from a January 1946 report compiled by the British, exclusively from original German material, that it did exist. It was out there somewhere. It might still be out there. There's still a lot of material that hasn't yet been looked at by modern historians. So there's still the chance, there's still the hope that I might be able to find something else out about it. But right now, it's just in the wind.
There are a lot of speculative secret project designs out there on the internet, so flying saucers and so on. Would you ever include those in your titles?
I think if I was able to find some hard documentary evidence from contemporary sources which showed that the Nazis had worked on some kind of flying saucer, or Vril Energy, or Die Glock, the bell, or whatever it is, I would be a fool not to include that. To show the world that these things were genuine. But so far I found no evidence to suggest that any of that kind of strange, otherworldly stuff was ever looked at, was ever real, and wasn't just some sort of post-war fantasy. It would be great to be able to show that sort of stuff was actually genuine, but unfortunately, I think I've looked through probably about 500,000 pages of documents from German aircraft manufacturers, from the German Air Ministry, from the various institutions, experimental institutions that worked alongside both the manufacturers and the ministry, and I've never seen anything to give any kind of solid grounding, no evidence whatsoever really to support any of those extraterrestrial type, conspiracy theory type, speculative designs.
Dan, I'd like to thank you for your time. I'm sure everyone's found that really interesting. So really want everyone to get involved. So the title itself will be on sale in September, and really appreciate all your comments and feedback. Myself and Dan will spend our time running through them, hopefully some interesting ideas and projects you'd like us to have a look at, and hopefully we'll see them in a future issue sometime soon.
Do 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 do.